The large hall at the back of the Shady Acres retirement village was never the busiest place in the building, but it had a certain kind of feeling to it that the residents liked. It was quiet, mostly, save for the low, steady hum of the air conditioner that worked hard to keep the summer heat at bay. The walls were painted a soft, calming color, not white, but something like a very pale cream that made the big windows look brighter than they actually were. During the day, sunbeams would cut through the glass and stretch across the carpet, highlighting little motes of dust that danced in the light. It was a peaceful place, a sanctuary where people could sit and think without being disturbed. But the real heart of the room sat right in the center. It was a grand piano, finished in a deep, glossy black that shone like a mirror. It was a beautiful thing, with curves that looked elegant and strong, but for a long time it had been silent. It wasn't used for sing-alongs anymore, and the weekly music club had moved to a smaller room with a keyboard that didn't need tuning. The grand piano just sat there, gathering a thin layer of dust on its lid, looking like a sleeping beast that hadn't woken up in years. It was roped off with a small velvet ribbon, a silent sign that said, "Do not disturb." On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the hall was mostly empty. An old man named Mr. Arthur was making his slow way across the carpet. He was 90 years old, and his body moved at a different pace than his mind. His back was slightly stooped, and he walked with a cane that tapped a gentle rhythm on the floor. Tap, pause, tap, pause. His clothes were neat but old, a cardigan sweater that had seen many winters, and trousers that were pressed just right. He was a man who usually kept to himself. The staff knew him as polite and soft-spoken. He spent most of his days sitting in the corners of rooms, holding a small, worn photograph that he kept in his breast pocket just over his heart. Arthur's eyes were fixed straight ahead. He wasn't looking at the empty chairs or the pictures on the wall. He was looking only at the piano. There was a strange intensity in his gaze, a look that you don't often see on a face that has lived for 9 decades. He looked like a man who was walking toward a long-lost friend, or perhaps walking toward a memory that he had tried to forget but couldn't. Sitting on a folding chair near the entrance was his daughter, Lisa. She was a woman in her 60s, with tired eyes and a kind smile. She had come to visit him, as she did every Tuesday. Beside her was the facility's director, Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was a practical woman who cared about the residents, but she also cared about the rules and the safety of the building. They were chatting quietly about the menu for the upcoming week, but their conversation stopped the moment they saw where Arthur was heading. Arthur didn't hear them. He reached the velvet ribbon. For a moment he stood there, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to lift the barrier. The cane wobbled in his other hand, but he steadied himself against the side of the piano bench. He looked at the instrument with a mixture of fear and love. The black surface reflected his face back at him, a face full of lines and wrinkles, eyes watery and pale. Lisa stood up quickly, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. "Dad," she called out. Her voice was gentle, but there was a sharp edge of worry to it. "Where are you going? Come sit back down with us." Mrs. Gable stood up as well, smoothing out her skirt. She walked toward Arthur, her steps brisk but careful. She knew that Mr. Arthur could get a bit confused in the afternoons. Sometimes he forgot where the bathroom was, and sometimes he forgot what year it was. She didn't want him to hurt himself. "Mr. Arthur," Mrs. Gable said, raising her voice just enough to be heard across the quiet room. She put on her best manager voice, the one she used to calm people down without being rude. "Please, let's step away from there. You know you aren't supposed to go near the rope." Arthur didn't turn around. He just leaned in closer to the piano, his nose almost touching the cold black wood. He ran a hand lightly over the fallboard, the part that covered the keys. It was smooth and cool. "Don't touch that piano, Mr. Arthur," Mrs. Gable said, a bit more firmly this time as she got closer. "We can't have you sitting there. The tuner was here just last week, and he said the frame is unstable. It's very old. The strings are brittle and could snap at any moment. We're actually worried the whole thing might collapse if someone puts too much weight on the keys." Lisa came up beside her, looking at her father with a mix of sympathy and frustration. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "Dad, please listen to her. It's not safe. You could get hurt if a string snaps or if the leg gives way. Please, come over here. I have some cookies in my bag." Arthur looked at his daughter then. His eyes were cloudy, looking through her rather than directly at her for a second before they focused. He looked down at the keys, hidden behind the fallboard. He remembered the weight of them, the resistance, the sound. It had been so long. "It's our anniversary, Lisa," Arthur whispered. His voice was raspy, thin as paper. 55 years today. She loved this song." Lisa's face softened. She looked at Mrs. Gable and gave a sad little shrug. This happened sometimes. Her mother had passed away 5 years ago, but to Arthur it could feel like yesterday, or it could feel like 50 years ago. His memory was a jumbled puzzle. "I know, Dad," Lisa said softly, trying to guide him away by the elbow. "We had cake earlier, remember? We celebrated. Martha isn't here anymore, Dad. She's gone." Arthur didn't move his feet. He felt heavy, rooted to the spot. "He loved this song," he said again, a little louder this time. "I used to play it, in the kitchen, on the old upright."
"We know," Mrs. Gable said, trying to be helpful but keeping her distance. "But please, Mr. Arthur, don't touch that piano. It really is dangerous. We can't take the risk." The tension in the room began to thicken. The low hum of the air conditioner seemed to get louder in the silence that followed. Arthur looked at the fallboard again. He knew the women were trying to protect him. They thought he was just a confused old man who didn't understand the danger of a heavy object. They thought he didn't understand that the piano was broken. But Arthur wasn't thinking about the mechanics of the instrument. He wasn't thinking about the wood or the strings or the liability insurance. He was thinking about the way the music used to fill the house. He was thinking about the way his wife used to hum along while she did the dishes. He was thinking that for the first time in years, the silence in his own head was too loud and he needed to break it. He took a shaky breath. His hands were trembling more now, not from age so much as from the sheer effort of what he was about to do. He knew they were watching him. He knew they were worried. But he also knew that if he didn't do it right now, in this second, the moment would pass and he might never find the courage again. "Just one note," Arthur murmured. He said it so softly that the women almost didn't hear him. Just to hear her again. Mrs. Gable stepped closer, extending her hand as if to physically stop him. "Mr. Arthur, I'm asking you to stop. Please don't touch that piano. I don't want to have to call an ambulance." Lisa squeezed his arm, pulling a little harder. "Dad, no. Let's go." Arthur felt the pull on his arm, but he didn't feel it in his body. He felt detached, floating in a memory. He looked down at the fallboard. He didn't use his hands to lift it. Instead, he used his knee. With a slow, painful effort, he lowered himself onto the bench. The wood let out a loud, ominous creak that echoed through the hall. Lisa gasped, pulling her hand back as if she had been burned. "Dad!" Mrs. Gable froze, her eyes wide. She was terrified the bench was about to give way, but it held. Arthur sat there, hunched over the keys, a small, fragile figure in front of the giant black machine. He lifted his trembling right hand, his fingers curved slightly, hovering just above the ivory keys. "Don't!" Mrs. Gable cried out, stepping forward. Arthur didn't listen. He closed his eyes for a brief second, took a deep breath, and brought his hand down. The air in the large hall seemed to stop moving the moment the old man's body made contact with the bench. The low hum of the air conditioner, which had been the only sound in the room just moments before, suddenly seemed to vanish. Mrs. Gable stood frozen near the entrance, her hand still raised in a gesture that was meant to stop him, but had arrived too late. She looked like a statue that had been tipped over and stuck in place. Her eyes were wide, darting from the old man's fragile back to the legs of the piano, half expecting the heavy wooden instrument to splinter and collapse right there on the spot. For Arthur, the world had narrowed down to the space directly in front of his nose. He could feel the cold, smooth surface of the bench beneath him. It felt harder than he remembered. He let out a long, shaky breath that seemed to rattle in his chest. He was sitting. He had actually done it. He had ignored the warnings, the worry in his daughter's voice, and the fear of the director. Now he was here. He was exactly where he needed to be, but the reality of the situation was much heavier than the fantasy in his head. Lisa took a hesitant step forward, her shoes making a soft squeak on the carpet. She looked at her father with a mix of fear and confusion. This wasn't like him. Arthur was a man who followed rules. He was a man who sat where he was told, ate what was put in front of him, and never caused a fuss. Seeing him defy Mrs. Gable, seeing him sit at a piano that was strictly off limits, was like watching a sheep suddenly decide it was a lion. "Dad," Lisa whispered again. She didn't shout this time. The sheer oddness of the moment had stolen the volume from her voice. "Please get up. You're going to hurt yourself." Arthur didn't turn around. He gave no indication that he had heard her. He just stared at the fallboard, the piece of wood that covered the keys. It was closed tight, like a book that didn't want to be read. He stared at his reflection in the black lacquer. The face looking back at him was tired. The skin around his eyes was drooping, and his mouth was slightly open as he struggled to catch his breath. He looked ancient. He looked weak. But inside, deep down in a place that didn't care about arthritis or fading memories, he felt a spark. It was a tiny, flickering light, but it was there. He remembered the way his hands used to move. He remembered the strength in his fingers when he was a younger man, playing for hours until his fingertips ached. He flexed his fingers slowly. The joints protested, sending sharp little stabs of pain up his wrists. "It's our anniversary, Lisa," he said again. His voice was stronger this time, but it still had that dreamy quality to it, as if he were speaking from inside a bubble. 55 years. I have to play it for her." Lisa walked over to the side of the piano, crouching down so she could look up at his face. She tried to catch his eye, but he was looking past her, into the past. "Dad, we know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't want to upset him, but she was terrified. She knew how fragile these old things could be. She had seen a documentary once about a piano crashing through a stage floor. "We celebrated, remember? We had that nice cake with the vanilla frosting. Mom isn't here. She can't hear you." Arthur blinked slowly. "She can hear," he whispered. "If I play it right, she can hear."
Mrs. Gable had finally moved her feet. She walked closer, keeping a safe distance, just in case the piano decided to tip over. She looked at Lisa and gave a small, helpless shrug. She didn't want to be the bad guy. She didn't want to be the strict enforcer who ruined a sweet moment between a father and his dead wife, but she had a job to do. She was responsible for the safety of everyone in this building. "Mr. Arthur," Mrs. Gable said, her voice soft but urgent. She leaned in, trying to reason with him. "The tuner was very specific. The metal frame inside is cracked. If you hit the keys hard, the tension in the strings could snap them. It's dangerous. Please, let's help you up. We can go to the garden. It's nice outside." Arthur didn't move toward the garden. He didn't move toward the door. He moved his hands. It was a slow, painful motion. He lifted his trembling right hand from his lap. It hovered in the air for a moment, shaking like a leaf in the wind. Lisa reached out, thinking he was losing his balance, but he steadied himself. He reached for the fallboard. "No, Dad," Lisa said, realizing what he was doing. "Don't open it. Just come with me." Arthur's fingers brushed against the cool wood. He hooked his fingertips under the edge. It was heavy, much heavier than he expected. He let out a grunt of effort as he pushed. The wood slid back, revealing the keys beneath. The sight of the keys hit Arthur like a physical blow. They were yellowed with age, some of them chipped, but to him, they were beautiful. They were 88 white and black soldiers waiting for orders. They sat there, silent and expectant. The silence of the room suddenly felt very loud. The air conditioner hummed again, but it sounded like a distant noise compared to the pounding of Arthur's heart in his ears. "Just one note," he said to himself, "just to hear her again." Mrs. Gable took a sharp breath in through her teeth. "Arthur, please, don't touch the keys. I'm begging you." Lisa stood up and put her hand on his shoulder. "Dad, stop, please, you're confused." Arthur wasn't confused. He had never been more clear-headed in his life. He knew exactly where he was. He knew that the women were afraid. He knew that his hands didn't work like they used to. But he also knew that if he didn't play this song, the silence in the room would swallow him whole. He felt a sudden, intense wave of grief for his wife, a grief so fresh and sharp that it felt like it happened yesterday. He missed her. He missed the way she laughed, the way she smelled, and the way she would tap her foot to the music when he played. He looked at the sheet music that was sitting on the stand. It was a piece that had been there for years, forgotten. It wasn't even his song. It was some old jazz standard that nobody played anymore. But he didn't need the paper. The music was written on his heart. It was etched into the pathways of his brain, deeper than the forgetfulness, deeper than the confusion. He lifted his hand higher. His fingers were curved, trying to find a shape they hadn't made in a decade. The tremor in his hand was violent now. He looked like he was trying to hold on to a bird that was trying to fly away. "Dad!" Lisa shouted, her fear spiking. She thought he was going to fall. "Mr. Arthur!" Mrs. Gable yelled, stepping forward to grab his arm. Arthur ignored them. The sounds of their voices faded into the background, becoming just noise. He focused entirely on the keys. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dusty air of the room. He closed his eyes for a brief second and saw her face. He saw her standing in their old kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, smiling at him. "I'm coming, Martha," he whispered. With a slow, determined motion, he brought his hand down. He didn't strike the keys with force. He was too weak for that. He let gravity pull his hand down. His fingers made contact with the ivory. Mrs. Gable flinched, expecting a disaster. She expected a loud crack of wood snapping, a twang of broken strings, or perhaps the whole instrument to lurch forward. She squeezed her eyes shut for a split second. But there was no crash. There was no snap of wood. When his fingers pressed the keys into the felt beneath them, the sound that came out wasn't a noise at all. It was a chord. It was a rich, resonant sound that seemed to bloom out of the silence like a flower opening in the morning sun. It wasn't the broken, thumping sound of a ruined instrument. It was a sound that was warm and full of tone. It was a sound that vibrated through the bench, up Arthur's spine and out into the room. The piano didn't collapse. It sang. The chord hung in the air, shimmering and beautiful. Mrs. Gable opened her eyes, her mouth slightly open. Lisa stopped pulling on his arm. The sheer beauty of the sound had stunned them into silence. It was a sound that commanded respect, a sound that demanded to be heard. It was clear, pure, and heartbreaking. The sound that came out of the piano wasn't a crash or a snap. It was something entirely different. It was a deep, rolling chord that seemed to fill the entire room, pushing against the walls and the ceiling. It felt heavy, not in a way that weighed you down, but in a way that made you feel like you were grounded to the spot. For a second, nobody moved. The vibration hummed in the air, settling in their chests, making the very hair on their arms stand up. Mrs. Gable stood frozen near the entrance, her hand still halfway up in a protective gesture. She had braced herself for the sound of breaking wood, the sharp twang of a snapping string, or perhaps even the heavy thud of the instrument tipping over. But the piano hadn't collapsed. It had sung. The sheer surprise of it kept her feet glued to the carpet. She looked at the black glossy shape, expecting to see a crack appearing somewhere, but it just sat there, looking as innocent and still as ever. Lisa was the first to move. She took a sharp, quick breath, her hand flying to her mouth. The sound was so beautiful, so clear, that it didn't seem real. It felt like a sound from a dream. She looked at her father's back. He was hunched over the keys, a small, fragile
silhouetted against the large, imposing instrument. She had expected him to hit a wrong note, or for his shaken hand to mash a group of keys together to make a messy noise. But the chord was perfect. It was in tune. It was full of a warmth that the old, dusty hall hadn't felt in years. "Dad?" Lisa whispered, but the word was lost in the fading echo of the music. Arthur didn't hear her. The moment his fingers touched the keys, something inside him shifted. The trembling in his hands didn't stop, but it changed. It wasn't a shake of fear or weakness anymore. It was a vibration of energy. The familiar feel of the ivory under his fingertips sent a spark racing up his arm, bypassing his arthritic joints and his tired muscles, going straight to his brain. He remembered this. He knew this feeling better than he knew how to walk. He didn't pause to check if the women were watching. He didn't wait for them to yell at him again. He moved his left hand. It was a slow, difficult movement. His fingers felt stiff, like rusted gears that needed oil. He had to think hard about where each finger was supposed to go. The thumb goes here. The pinky stretches there. It was a mental puzzle he hadn't solved in a decade. The second note came, then a third. He was playing a melody. It was a simple waltz, something slow and gentle. It wasn't a complicated classical piece that required speed. It was a song that required heart. Mrs. Gable slowly lowered her hands. Her professional training was telling her to run over there, to pull him off the bench, to scold him for disobeying a direct order. But her human side was telling her to wait. She had never heard a sound like this come out of that old instrument. She had been told it was broken, ruined beyond repair by time and neglect. But now it sounded like the most expensive piano in the world. The notes were singing with a clarity that made her heart ache. She took a step closer, her shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. She was mesmerized. The fear of the piano falling apart was fading, replaced by a confusion about how this was even possible. The tuner had said the frame was unstable. Yet as Arthur played another chord, the piano only seemed to lean into the music, embracing the vibrations. Lisa moved closer to the side of the piano, crouching down so she could see her father's face. His eyes were closed. The wrinkles around his eyes seemed to smooth out a little as his face relaxed. The look of confusion that usually clouded his eyes was gone. In its place was an intense concentration and peace. He wasn't in the retirement home anymore. He wasn't sitting on a rickety bench. He was somewhere else. Arthur heard the music in his head before he played it. He saw the small apartment they lived in 50 years ago. He saw the light coming in through the kitchen window. He saw his wife, Martha, standing by the stove, stirring a pot of soup. He could see her swaying her hips slightly to the rhythm of the music. He could hear her humming along softly, her voice blending with the notes. It was so real to him that he could almost smell the onions simmering on the stove. His right hand moved to join the left. It was a bit clumsy at first. His timing was off. The notes were a little jagged, but he didn't stop. He didn't care about the mistakes. He cared about the flow. He pushed harder on the keys, demanding a louder sound. The piano responded. The volume grew, filling the empty hall. Mrs. Gable stood near the music stand, watching the old man's hands. It was a miracle of coordination. Just 10 minutes ago, this man could barely walk across the room without his cane. He struggled to lift a cup of tea to his lips without spilling it. But now his hands were dancing. They were jumping from key to key with a precision that was terrifying to watch. It was as if the music had unlocked a hidden reserve of strength in his body. "He's really doing it," Mrs. Gable whispered to herself. She had seen residents with dementia suddenly remember skills from their past before, women who could still knit complicated patterns even though they didn't recognize their own children, men who could fix a radio but couldn't remember their own names. But this was different. This was active. This was emotional. The song wasn't fast. It was a slow, sad waltz. The melody climbed up the scale, hopeful and bright, and then drifted back down, melancholic and low. It sounded like a conversation, like two people talking, and then falling silent, then talking again. Lisa looked at her father's hands. They were pale and spotted with age, the skin thin and papery. But as they moved over the black and white keys, they looked young again. The movements were fluid. The tremor was still there, but it didn't matter. The shaking added a tremolo to the sound, a vibrato that made the notes quiver with emotion. It wasn't a perfect performance by a strict musical standard, but it was a perfect expression of feeling. The silence in the room was gone now, replaced by the music. The dusty air seemed to clear. The sunlight streaming through the window seemed to get brighter, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the beams like golden sparks. Arthur's mind was racing through memories. He remembered the day they bought the piano. It was used even then, but they were so proud. He remembered moving it up 3 flights of stairs with Martha guiding him, laughing and sweating. He remembered teaching their daughter, Lisa, how to play chopsticks on it when she was a little girl. He remembered playing Christmas carols, with everyone singing along, off-key but happy. Then he remembered the silence. He remembered the day the piano stopped being played. He remembered Martha getting sick. He remembered the long, quiet years after she was gone, years where the piano just sat in the corner, covered in a gray cloth, gathering dust like a tombstone. He poured all those years of silence into the music now. He played the frustration, the sadness, and the love that he still held on to. He played like he was trying to make up for every day that the instrument had been quiet. He was playing for her.
Lisa felt tears stinging her eyes. She watched her father's face. A single tear was rolling down his cheek, catching in the wrinkles of his skin. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because he was letting it all out. The dam had broken. The music was the water rushing through. "He hasn't played since before the stroke," Lisa whispered to Mrs. Gable, her voice shaking. "I didn't think he remembered how." Mrs. Gable nodded slowly. She felt a lump in her own throat. She had spent the afternoon worried about insurance liabilities and safety hazards. She had worried about the budget for the repairs. But standing here, listening to the music, all of that seemed so small. It seemed so unimportant. This wasn't a hazard. This was a gift. Arthur moved into the chorus of the song. The melody became stronger, more insistent. His left hand was keeping a steady rhythm, a heartbeat sound. Papa, papa. It was a dance rhythm. He closed his eyes tighter, and in the darkness of his mind, he saw Martha. She wasn't sick anymore. She was young and beautiful, wearing her favorite blue dress. She was dancing in the empty space of the hall, spinning around with her arms outstretched, smiling at him. The piano, supposedly brittle and broken, was holding up beautifully. The sound resonated through the wooden floorboards, vibrating against the soles of their shoes. It was a rich, warm tone that carried a history within it. Arthur forgot about his aching back. He forgot about his trembling legs. He forgot about the women watching him. He was just a pair of hands and a heart full of music. He wasn't an old man in a retirement home. He was a musician. He was a husband. He was alive. And as the melody swelled, rising towards the high notes, he prepared himself for the hardest part of the song, the part that required both hands to work together in perfect harmony, the part that would take him all the way back to her. The music grew. It didn't just stay in one spot. It began to move through the room like a living thing. Arthur's hands, which had started so shaky and slow, were beginning to find a rhythm. It wasn't a perfect rhythm, and his timing was a little uneven, but the emotion behind it was powerful enough to smooth out the rough edges. The melody he was playing was a simple waltz, something that belonged in a cozy living room rather than a large hall, but the sound was big enough to fill the space. The piano, which Mrs. Gable had feared would collapse under the pressure, seemed to be welcoming the attention. As Arthur struck the keys with more force, the instrument responded with a warmth and richness that felt impossible.
The notes didn't sound tinny or broken. They sounded deep and full, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the bench where Arthur sat. The strings, which were supposedly brittle and rusty, sang with a clarity that made the air seem cleaner. It was a sound that demanded to be felt, not just heard. Mrs. Gable stood near the wall, completely still. Her arms were now hanging loosely at her sides. She had forgotten about the insurance, the safety hazards, and the rules. All she could do was watch and listen. She realized that the tuner had been wrong about the piano, or maybe the piano had just been waiting for the right person to wake it up. It was a mystery she couldn't solve, and for once she didn't want to. Lisa had moved from the side of the piano to a spot a few feet in front of the instrument. She wasn't looking at the keys anymore. She was looking at her father. It was a strange sight to see him sitting up so straight. Usually his shoulders were slumped forward, his head bowed down as if he was carrying a heavy weight on his neck. But now his back was straight. He was leaning into the music. His head was lifted slightly, his eyes closed tight, as if he was seeing something written on the back of his eyelids. The song shifted. It moved from the soft introduction part into the main melody. This was the part that required both hands to work together. Arthur's left hand kept a steady, bouncing beat, the heartbeat of the song, while his right hand began to weave the tune. It was a bittersweet melody. It had a happy lilt to it, like a laugh, but there was a sadness underneath it, like a tear. Lisa recognized it instantly. It was the song her father used to play on Sunday afternoons. The memories came flooding back to her so fast they made her dizzy. She remembered being a little girl, sitting on the carpet, playing with her dolls while the music filled the room. She remembered the smell of roast beef cooking in the oven and the sound of her mother singing along softly. She hadn't heard that melody in over a decade. Hearing it now was like being transported back in time. She felt a lump form in her throat, thick and hard. Arthur was lost in the music. His mind was no longer in the dusty hall with the humming air conditioner. He was in his old house. He could see the sunlight hitting the beige curtains. He could see Martha. She wasn't just a memory or a photograph anymore. In his mind, she was there. She was standing right in front of the piano, wearing her favorite yellow dress, the one with the tiny flowers on it. She was dancing in the empty space of the hall, spinning around with her arms outstretched, smiling at him. His fingers, stiff and painful just minutes ago, seemed to have a life of their own. They glided from one key to the next. The arthritis that usually knotted his joints seemed to dissolve, replaced by the flow of the music. It was a medical mystery, really, how the body could forget its pain when the mind was so focused on something else. The song climbed higher. The notes became faster, a run of descending notes that sounded like water tumbling down a staircase. Arthur's right hand flew across the keys. It wasn't technically perfect. He hit a note here and there, a discordant sound that stuck out, but he didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He kept going, turning the mistake into just another part of the song. That was the beauty of it. It was real. It was human.
Mrs. Gable found herself wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. She didn't know Arthur well. She knew him as the quiet man who sat in the corner, the man who sometimes needed help cutting his meat or finding his room. She saw him as a patient, someone who needed care. But looking at him now, she realized she had never really seen him at all. He wasn't just a frail old man waiting for the end of his days. He was a musician. He was a husband who was still deeply in love. He was a person with a soul that was just as vibrant as it had ever been. The intensity of the music built. The chords became thicker, more complex. Arthur was leaning forward now, swaying slightly with the rhythm. He was putting everything he had into it. He was pouring 55 years of marriage, 55 years of joy and sorrow into 3 minutes of music. Lisa watched his face. A tear escaped from his closed eye and rolled down his cheek, dropping onto the collar of his sweater. He wasn't crying out of sadness. He was crying because he was doing what he was meant to do. He was connecting. For a brief, shining moment, the fog of his confusion had lifted. The dementia that usually held his mind in a tight grip had loosened its hold. He knew exactly who he was and where he was. He was a man playing for his wife. The piano thundered. Arthur hit a low bass note with his left hand that resonated through the entire hall. It was a sound that vibrated in their chests. It felt like the heartbeat of the building itself. Then, slowly, the music began to change. It started to wind down. The fast runs were replaced by slower, more gentle notes. The volume began to drop. Arthur was bringing the song to a close. His hands were moving with great care now. He wasn't rushing. He was savoring every note, treating each one like a precious gem that he didn't want to let go of. He played the final phrase. It was a simple resolution of notes, ending on a single sustained chord. It was a sound that said, "I am here. I love you. Goodbye." He held the keys down, letting the sound ring out into the silence of the room. He didn't lift his hands immediately. He kept them pressed against the keys, feeling the vibration slowly dying away. He sat there, head bowed, shoulders heaving slightly as he caught his breath. The silence that followed wasn't the same heavy silence that had been in the room before. This silence was different. It was a sacred silence. It was the silence that comes after something truly important has been said. The final echoes of the piano faded into the walls of the hall. The dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to stop moving. The hum of the air conditioner returned, sounding incredibly loud and annoying after the beauty of the music. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Gable was standing with her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide and wet. Lisa was standing frozen, tears streaming down her face, looking at her father with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. The room felt empty, yet full. It felt like a vacuum had sucked all the air out, leaving them all breathless. Arthur sat there for a long moment. The energy that had fueled him seemed to drain away, leaving him feeling tired and heavy. His hands began to tremble again, the weakness returning to his fingers now that the music was gone. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his hands from the keys. He placed them in his lap. He stared down at the black and white ivories, now silent again. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a wonderful dream and was sad to find himself back in reality. He took a deep, shaky breath. The room was so quiet that the sound of his inhale was audible. He turned his head slightly, looking toward the empty space where, in his mind, Martha had been standing. He whispered something so soft that no one else could hear. It was just 2 words. Then the silence took over completely. It was a heavy, thick blanket that wrapped around the 3 of them. No one dared to break it. There were no words that were good enough to follow what had just happened. The silence was the only way to honor the music. It was the only way to honor the love that had just been poured out into the room. They stood there, frozen in time, held in place by the weight of the moment, unwilling to let it go. The final notes of the song drifted away, disappearing into the high ceiling of the large hall like smoke. The last vibration of the strings faded into nothingness, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier and more important than the music itself. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a full one. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room after a thunderstorm has passed, when the air feels cleaned and washed. Arthur sat on the bench, his back still slightly hunched over the keys. His hands rested in his lap, fingers curled inward as if they were trying to hold on to the feeling of the ivory. His chest rose and fell with a deep, shaky rhythm. The energy that had surged him just moments ago, giving him the strength to play with such passion, had drained away as quickly as it had arrived. Now he just felt tired. A deep, bone-weary tiredness that settled into his shoulders and made his arms feel like lead. He didn't open his eyes right away. He kept them shut, holding on to the image in his mind. He could still see Martha standing there in the yellow dress, smiling at him. He could still feel the warmth of the kitchen they had shared so many years ago. He was afraid that if he opened his eyes,
the vision would vanish, and he would be back in the Shady Acres retirement home, just an old man forgotten by time. Lisa stood a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth. Her eyes were tears streaming down her face, hot and fast, dripping onto her blouse. She wasn't making a sound. The silence was too strong to break. She felt like she was witnessing a holy moment, something private and sacred that she had been allowed to see by accident. She looked at her father and saw him in a completely new light. He wasn't just the old, confused man who needed help remembering where his room was. He was a man who loved deeply. He was an artist. He was a husband who was still deeply in love.
Mrs. Gable stood near the entrance, rooted to the spot. Her clipboard, which she usually held onto so tightly, was dangling loosely in her hand. Her eyes were wide and wet. She had been ready to scold him, ready to drag him away from the instrument for his own safety. Now she felt a deep sense of shame for thinking the piano was just a piece of junk and that Arthur was just a liability. She realized that she had almost stopped something beautiful from happening. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, not caring about her makeup. She felt small in the presence of the music that had just been played. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was the only movement in the entire hall. Even the air conditioner seemed to have paused, humbled by the melody. Slowly, Arthur opened his eyes. The bright light of the afternoon sun hit them, making him blink. He looked around the room. The yellow dress was gone. The kitchen was gone. He was just sitting in the big, dusty hall, but the feeling in his chest was different. The heavy weight of grief that he carried every single day felt lighter. It wasn't gone. He knew Martha was gone, and he knew he would miss her forever, but the sharp edges of the pain had been smoothed out. He had said goodbye to her the only way he knew how. He had given her the song she loved. He turned his head slowly to look at his daughter. His eyes were watery and red-rimmed, but they were clear. For the first time in a long time, there was no fog of confusion in them. He knew exactly who she was. "Lisa," he whispered. His voice was raspy and weak, worn out from the effort of the performance. Lisa took a hesitant step forward, her knees feeling weak. "Dad," she choked out, that was beautiful." Arthur gave a small, tired smile. The corners of his mouth twitched upward. "She heard it," he said softly. "She was right there. She was dancing." Lisa let out a sob, but she swallowed it down. She walked over to the bench and knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his sweater. She held him tight. "I know, Dad. I know she did. I heard it too." Arthur leaned his head against hers. He patted her back awkwardly with his trembling hand. It was a small gesture, but it was full of love. The barrier that his illness had built between them over the last few years seemed to have dissolved. In the wake of the music, he was just her dad again. Mrs. Gable finally moved. She walked slowly across the carpet, her footsteps soft. She stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to intrude on the moment between father and daughter. She looked at the old man with a look of profound respect. "Mr. Arthur," she said gently. Her voice didn't have the bossy tone it usually had. It was quiet, almost reverent. That was the most wonderful thing I have ever heard in this building. I'm sorry I tried to stop you." Arthur looked up at her. He didn't seem to mind that she had been yelling at him just a few minutes ago. "It's all right," he said. "You were just doing your job. You were trying to keep an old fool safe." Mrs. Gable shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "That piano isn't junk, and neither are you." She looked at the glossy black instrument. She had been convinced it would fall apart, but now she saw it differently. It wasn't just wood and strings. It was a vessel. It was a way for people to speak when their words failed them. She made a mental note right there to call a tuner, a real one, to come and fix it properly. She promised herself that the piano would not sit silent in this hall ever again. If Mr. Arthur could find the strength to play, then the facility could find the money to fix it. "Can you help me up, Lisa?" Arthur asked after a long moment. "My legs have gone to sleep." "Of course, Dad," Lisa said, standing up. She took his arm and helped him slide off the bench. He stood up slowly, his joints popping and creaking. He leaned heavily on his cane, but he stood tall. He looked back at the piano one last time. He reached out and touched the fall board, the smooth black wood. He didn't open it again. He just let his hand rest there for a second, saying a silent thank you to the instrument. "Good night, old friend," he whispered to the keys. He turned away then, leaning on his daughter's arm. They began the slow walk toward the exit. Mrs. Gable held the door open for them as they walked through. The walk seemed a little easier than it had earlier, as if the music had somehow loosened the stiffness in Arthur's legs. As they reached the hallway, Arthur stopped. He paused and looked back over his shoulder into the center of the room. The sun was setting now, casting long golden shadows across the floor. The piano sat there, silent and still. But to Arthur, it didn't look like a dead object anymore. It looked like a promise. He looked at Mrs. Gable and gave her a small nod. He said, "Thank you." "Thank you, Mr. Arthur," she replied. Lisa squeezed her father's arm. She felt different, too. For years she had visited him out of obligation, out of duty, feeling sad and helpless as he slipped away from her. But today she had seen a spark of the man he used to be. She had seen his soul. She knew that even when he forgot her name, even when the confusion took over completely, a part of him would still be that young man playing the waltz for his wife. That part of him was untouchable. It was safe. They walked out of the hall and into the corridor. The door clicked shut behind them. Inside the hall, the silence returned. But it wasn't a lonely silence anymore. The room felt warmer. The air seemed to shimmer with the memory of the melody. The dust motes danced in the fading light, swirling in the space where the music had been. The piano waited. It sat in the center of the room, patient and still. It knew that the old man wouldn't play again. It knew that his hands were too tired and his time was too short. But it also knew that what happened that afternoon was enough. The silence had been broken. The love had been shared. And in that large, empty hall, the music would never truly be gone. It would stay in the walls, echoing softly, a testament to a heart that never forgot how to love.